I want you to picture something with me right now as we start this deep dive. Put yourself in an incredibly specific, verifiable, historical moment.
Okay, set the scene.
Imagine it's 4:45 on a Saturday afternoon.
Hmm.
It's March, so the spring air is, just starting to cut through the winter chill.
Mm-hmm.
And the year is 1911.
Right.
You are a young woman, maybe 16 years old, and you're standing at a window on the ninth floor of a massive modern building in New York City. You're looking down at Washington Place below you.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the horse-drawn carriages, some early automobiles, people walking around in heavy coats, and you are just absolutely exhausted in a way that, frankly, settles deep into your bones.
Yeah, the kind of total physical depletion.
Exactly. You are waiting for the quitting whistle to blow in 15 minutes. Because that whistle means the end of a work week that defies modern comprehension.
It really does.
6 days of 10 to 12-hour shifts, hunched over a heavy, clattering sewing machine. You're breathing in cotton dust and machine oil all day, making blouses for other people to wear. That whistle is your finish line.
Yeah, you take a breath, you feel the vibration of hundreds of machines rattling the floorboards beneath your feet, and you go back to your station.
Right. It's a very ordinary, quiet, human moment.
It is the kind of moment that happens, millions of times a day all over the industrializing world at that time. Just the mundane anticipation of finally going home.
But now, I want you to fast forward exactly 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You're that same young worker, and you are standing at that exact same ninth-floor window. But the world has ended.
Yeah.
The room behind you is a complete inferno. Flames are licking across the ceiling, feeding on the very air you breathe. The one exit door to the stairs, the single door that you and over 200 other workers were supposed to use, is padlocked shut. Padlocked from the outside. And the building's flimsy exterior fire escape is already buckling and twisting under the weight of dozens of your coworkers who desperately tried to climb down. There's literally nowhere else to go. You are looking down at a crowd that has gathered on the street below, drawn by the sirens, right? And that crowd is looking up at you. And both you and the crowd realize, with absolute horrifying clarity, that the fire ladders only reach the 6th floor.
They're just too short.
Too short. There is nothing they can do to save you.
It is the ultimate nightmare of helplessness. And the worst part is, it was entirely engineered by a series of deliberate choices.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore the historical documentation surrounding the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911.
And we are going to examine the fire itself, absolutely.
Right, but we have to look deeper than the flames. We're going to unpack the specific labor conditions and the economic calculus that turned a workspace into a death trap.
We're going to look at the stunning failure of the legal system afterward, too. The one that allowed the architects of this disaster to walk away completely free.
Completely free. And, crucially, we're going to break down how the survivors and witnesses of this nightmare channeled their trauma into a total, ground-up rewriting of American workplace safety laws.
Yeah, that's the legacy part.
I want to say this directly to you, the listener, right up front. If the doors in your own workplace open outward, if they remain unlocked during business hours, if there are sprinklers in your ceiling, it is a direct, linear result of what happened to 146 workers on that specific Saturday afternoon.
That frames our central thesis perfectly. Because when you look at the primary sources, the court records, the union documentation, this is not just a story about a fire.
What is it about then?
It is fundamentally a story about power. It's a story about labor, capital, and perhaps most importantly, who gets believed in a society.
Right. Who gets listened to.
Exactly. The real tragedy here is not a story of ignorance. It's not that people didn't know the dangers of these high-rise factories.
No, they definitely do.
The tragedy is that the workers had already sounded the alarm about these exact conditions, and those warnings were entirely systematically ignored simply because of who was giving them.
I want to explore the mechanics of that ignored warning. But to do that, we really have to understand the world these women were working in. Let's look at the human and economic landscape of 1911 New York.
Okay, let's do it.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Company occupied the top 3 floors, the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building, just off Washington Square Park. And the men who ran this operation, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, They were not minor players, were they?
Not at all. Blank and Harris were known throughout the garment industry as the Shirtwaist Kings.
The Shirtwaist Kings.
Yeah, and I should note, this title was not bestowed upon them with any affection by their workers. They were incredibly powerful, wealthy figures who had capitalized on a massive shift in American fashion and culture.
We should probably define what a shirtwaist actually is,
Uh.
because the cultural context of this garment is vital. It's not just a shirt.
Yeah.
When I was reading through the sources, the analogy that immediately jumped to mind was the fast fashion of its era, but combined with, like, a symbol of women's liberation.
That is a highly accurate parallel. A shirtwaist was essentially a button-down blouse, often modeled after menswear but tailored for women.
Okay, so a bit more structured.
Yeah, because before the shirtwaist, women's clothing was largely custom-made, restrictive, and heavily layered. The shirtwaist was mass-produced, relatively affordable, and very practical. It became the defining look of the Gibson girl aesthetic.
Right, the modern active woman.
Exactly. But more importantly, it was the uniform of the new working woman. As more women entered offices, retail shops, and clerical roles, they needed practical professional attire. The shirtwaist represented independence and modernity.
Which creates this dark, incredible irony, doesn't it? The very garment that symbolizes the liberation and professional advancement of the American woman is being manufactured by a workforce that is entirely subjugated, invisible, and heavily exploited.
It's a profound contradiction.
The demographics of the Triangle Factory floor are just staggering. You are looking at a workforce that is overwhelmingly young, many of them newly arrived Jewish and Italian immigrants. Some of these workers were 14, 15 years old.
And we have to look at how that workforce was managed. Because Blank and Harris didn't just hire these young women directly in a modern HR sense.
They didn't.
No. They utilized a deeply exploitative internal contracting system. Blank and Harris would hire a few male contractors and pay them a bulk rate to produce a certain number of garments.
Okay, so a middleman system.
Exactly. Those contractors would then hire the young immigrant women out of their own pockets, paying them as little as possible to maximize their own cut.
Wow. So the incentive is to squeeze them as hard as humanly possible.
Right. It created an environment of intense surveillance, physical exhaustion, and absolute ruthless efficiency.
It's an economic machine that requires maximum output with minimal overhead. We are talking about girls working up to 70-plus hours a week for just a few dollars, being charged for the needles that broke on their machines.
Which happened a lot.
Being charged for the electricity they used, and being fined if they were a few minutes late.
Exactly. And that crushing economic reality is what sparked resistance. These young women were not just passive victims waiting for a tragedy, you know.
No, they definitely weren't.
They were active, militant participants in the labor movement. Which brings us to a crucial piece of context that often gets stripped out of the simplified textbook version of this history.
The 1909 strike.
Yes, the uprising of the 20,000.
The scale of this uprising is what shocked me in the research. Tell us about the mechanics of this strike, because it wasn't just a small protest outside one building.
Not at all. In November 1909, a little over a year before the fire, the tension in the garment industry just snapped. It started at a massive meeting at Cooper Union in New York.
The big hall, right?
Yeah. The workers were listening to union leaders urge caution, saying they needed to take it slow, until a young 23-year-old Ukrainian immigrant named Clara Limlik took the stage.
And she had already been beaten by hired thugs on picket lines before this, right?
She had. She was tough. She essentially got up there and said, "I have no further patience for talk. I move that we go on a general strike." And they did.
Just like that.
Just like that. The next morning, garment workers across the city began walking out. It was organized substantially through the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU.
Over 20,000 shirtwaist workers walked off the job. And the demands were not abstract. They wanted a 20% pay increase, a 52-hour work week, and, vitally for our discussion today, they demanded safer working conditions.
Specifically regarding fire safety.
Right. They were specific about fire escapes and unlocked doors. And the workers from the Triangle Factory itself were at the forefront of this. They literally walked out, demanding these exact safety measures.
Yes, and they faced severe consequences for it. It was a brutal winter that year. These young women were on the picket lines in the freezing cold, and they were met with organized violence.
From the owners.
From the owners. Factory owners hired private thugs, often local mobsters, to physically beat the striking women.
And where were the police during all this?
Well, the police arrested the teenage girls for disorderly conduct rather than the men who were assaulting them.
Unbelievable. So the state and the capital owners are working in tandem to crush this strike.
Basically, yes. But eventually, the sheer scale of the strike forces a compromise in the industry. Many factory owners finally caved to the pressure. They signed the strike settlement, agreeing to union recognition, better pay, and basic fire safety demands.
But not our guys. Not the Shirtwaist Kings.
No, Blank and Harris were among the most stubborn, resistant employers in the entire city. They adamantly refused to recognize the union.
They just held out.
They actively rejected the demands. They held out, hired replacement workers, and eventually forced their workforce back under mostly the exact same conditions.
And they specifically, vehemently refused to agree to the demand to keep the exit doors unlocked during working hours.
They wouldn't budge on it.
Let me stop you there, because that contradicts the basic premise of running a business where your primary asset is your workforce. If the workers literally shut down your factory over locked doors a year earlier, and if the entire industry is moving toward better safety, how did Blank and Harris justify keeping those doors locked?
It's hard for us to grasp today.
I really want to break down the business logic there, because it's not just mustache-twirling villainy, is it? It's a specific calculation.
It comes down to a cold, ruthless, and terrifyingly common economic calculus. The doors were routinely locked during working hours, ostensibly to prevent workers from stealing shirtwaists or even stealing scraps of fabric.
To stop them from stealing scrap.
Yeah, and to prevent them from slipping out for unauthorized breaks. Blank and Harris prioritized their inventory over human life.
I want to paint a picture of the physical layout of the 9th floor, because it illustrates exactly how deliberate this was. The factory floors in the Asch Building were essentially giant open rooms.
Yeah,
Right?
massive open spaces.
Filled with long wooden tables. The sewing machines were bolted to these tables, and the tables were arranged in such a way that they created a maze. You couldn't just walk straight across the room.
No, you had to navigate these long, narrow aisles between the machines and the fabric bins.
And that layout was designed to funnel the workers toward one specific exit point at the end of the shift. By keeping the doors locked, they forced all the workers to exit through one single checkpoint by the freight elevator where a foreman would inspect their bags.
They had to open their purses to prove they weren't stealing.
So they engineered a death trap, specifically so they could search the purses of 14-year-old girls to make sure they weren't stealing a 50-cent blouse. The locked door wasn't an oversight.
Not at all.
It wasn't a broken latch that maintenance hadn't gotten around to fixing. It was a daily, intentional operational policy to maximize control, prevent shrinkage, and protect the profit margin.
Precisely. The environment was a primed, fully loaded weapon. The unions had struck over it. The workers had complained about it. Everyone involved knew the conditions.
They all knew.
They knew the floor was covered in flammable material, they knew the tables blocked movement, and they knew the doors were locked. It was just sitting there waiting for the inevitable stark.
Which brings us to the 20 minutes that changed American history.
Yeah.
Let's walk through the timeline of Saturday, March 25, 1911. The work week is almost over. Quitting time is roughly 5:30 p.m. People are getting ready to finally go home. And then at about 4:40 p.m., a fire breaks out on the 8th floor. Now, I want to be careful with the historical record here. Do we know exactly what started it?
We need to be precise here based on the investigative documentation. The exact ignition source of the fire was never conclusively proven in a court of law.
Right?
However, the leading historical theory, the most widely accepted explanation by fire marshals and historians, is that a cutter on the 8th floor flicked a discarded match or cigarette butt into one of the scrap bins under the cutting tables.
And we shouldn't just gloss over those scrap bins. Why were there massive bins of highly flammable cotton and tissue paper just lying around a crowded factory floor?
Because they had commercial value, the garments were cut from large layers of thin cotton, and the cutting process generated tons of scraps.
Just piles of it.
Yeah. These scraps were strewn beneath the cutting tables and had been allowed to pile up for months. The factory owners didn't pay for them to be cleared out regularly because those scraps could be sold in bulk to rag dealers.
So again, an economic decision. Hoarding flammable waste to sell for a few extra pennies provides the perfect kindling for the disaster.
Exactly. And we have to talk about the physical environment of the room itself. It wasn't just the bins. The floors were wooden. They were soaked in the oil that constantly dripped from hundreds of sewing machines.
Oh, wow.
The air itself was thick with suspended cotton dust. When that spark hit the scrap bin, it didn't just smolder. It fed on the oil, it fed on the air, and it basically exploded.
It spread with terrifying speed. It leaps from the scrap bins to the tissue paper patterns hanging above the tables to the wooden tables themselves. Now, the workers on the 8th floor reacted immediately, didn't they? They grabbed the emergency water buckets that were legally required to be there.
They did, but we need to talk about those buckets.
The buckets are a joke, right?
They were completely inadequate. Some were empty, others were just a few gallons of water against a fire that was spreading by the second.
Like throwing a glass of water on a bonfire.
Right. The 8th floor workers realize very quickly that they cannot fight this, and they begin to flee. And this is where we see a fatal systemic breakdown in communication.
Walk us through that, because the Asch Building had a modern communication system for the time. They had telephones.
They did. As the fire broke out on the 8th floor, a bookkeeper managed to use the telephone to alert the executives up on the 10th floor.
Where the owners were.
Yes. The 10th floor housed the administrative offices, including the offices of Blank and Harris. Because they received that warning, the vast majority of the people on the 10th floor, including the owners, were able to escape by scrambling over the roof to a neighboring building.
But the switchboard operator who made that call... Wait, she didn't call the 9th floor.
In the panic and the rapid spread of the fire, the warning never reached the 9th floor. By the time the workers on the 9th floor even realized there was a fire, it was roaring up the elevator shafts and the stairwells.
It bypassed them completely.
It had essentially bypassed the internal communication channels. The fire was already upon them, cutting off their escape routes before they even knew they were in danger.
So the workers on the 9th floor, over 200 of them, suddenly see smoke pouring through the windows and flames shooting up the shafts. Panic sets in, and they rush to the exits. And this is where the cascading structural failures begin. And I want to be very clear here for you listening. These were not accidents. These were the predictable outcomes of the architectural and managerial choices we just discussed.
Exactly.
Let's start with the Washington Place stairwell door.
The workers rushed through that maze of tables to the Washington Place door. This is the door they were accustomed to using. But when they arrive, they can't open it.
Because it's locked.
The deliberate choice made by Blank and Harris to prevent theft had now sealed them inside. The door was locked tight.
But there's an additional horrific mechanical failure here that we need to explain. Even if they had found the key in that moment of panic, the sheer physics of the situation doomed them.
Yes. The building codes at the time did not mandate outward swinging doors for factories. The Washington Place door opened inward into the factory floor.
Oh, God.
As the fire advanced, the panic increased. Hundreds of young women rushed the door, pressing against it in a desperate crush.
Just a wall of human bodies.
Right. The sheer weight of human bodies pressing against that inward swinging door meant that even if it had been unlocked, they wouldn't have been able to pull it open against the pressure of the crowd.
The architecture itself weaponized their panic. So, the Washington Place door is blocked. The workers turn to the alternative exit, which is the building's single exterior fire escape. We mentioned this in the intro, but the mechanics of why this failed are vital to understand.
The Asch Building was a modern, fireproof building by 1911 standards. The structure itself, the brick and the steel, didn't burn, but the fire escape was essentially decorative.
Wait, decorative? Like it wasn't functional?
It was a flimsy iron structure bolted to the back of the building, descending down into a narrow enclosed courtyard. It had never been load tested for a mass evacuation of hundreds of panicked people.
Because it was just there to check a box for the minimal building codes of the era. The owners didn't care if it worked. They just needed it to be there to satisfy the inspector.
Precisely. And as the fire raged inside, the heat radiating through the windows began to warp the cheap iron of the fire escape.
Just melting it, essentially.
Yeah. As dozens of workers crowded onto it, trying to climb down the steep, narrow steps, the iron twisted and buckled under their collective weight and the extreme heat. The anchors pulled out of the masonry.
The entire structure collapsed.
It detached from the building, sending those who had made it out the window plunging 100 feet down to the concrete courtyard below. And in doing so, it permanently trapped everyone else who was still inside the 9th floor. The exit was gone.
Let's talk about the elevators. Because amidst all this architectural failure, there is a profound human element of heroism. The elevator shafts were acting like chimneys, right? Sucking the smoke and flames upward.
They were.
But the elevator operators didn't just run.
No, they didn't. This is a moment where we must highlight Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortillo, the operators of the passenger elevators. While the fire was raging, they made choice after choice to go back up into hell.
They made repeated trips.
They made several desperate runs up into the inferno. The workers on the 9th floor were prying open the elevator doors, trying to slide down the greasy cables, jumping onto the roof of the elevator cars.
It's just unimaginable panic.
Zito and Mortillo packed as many workers as they physically could into the cabs and brought them down to safety. They saved dozens of lives. But the mechanics of the fire eventually defeated them.
How so?
The heat became so extreme that the steel elevator tracks began to warp and expand. The shafts filled with thick, blinding smoke and eventually solid flames. The cars simply could not move anymore.
So let's look at the reality on the 9th floor at this exact moment. The Washington Place stairwell door is locked and blocked by a crush of bodies. The Green Street stairwell is completely engulfed in flames.
Right.
The fire escape has detached and collapsed into the courtyard. The elevators are dead. You are on the 9th floor of a high-rise building, and a literal wall of fire is moving across the room towards you, feeding on the fabric and the tables. We have to talk about the choice these workers were left with. It sets a profoundly somber tone, but we cannot look away from the reality of what this economic system produced.
They were backed against the windows, the flames burning their hair and their dresses. And they were left with a horrifying, unthinkable choice. Stay inside and burn alive, or jump from the windows to the pavement 90 feet below.
And dozens of them chose to jump. Accounts from the time, from journalists, police officers, bystanders, describe wave after wave of young women leaping from the windows. Some held hands.
Some embraced before they fell.
And this brings us to the perspective of the people on the street. The crowd that had gathered below, drawn by the sirens and the massive plume of smoke. There were local residents, there were police officers, and there were firefighters.
And I really want to emphasize the sheer devastating helplessness of the fire department in this moment. The fire department arrives quickly, they have their equipment, but it's useless.
It was completely obsolete for the modern city that New York had become.
Exactly. The tallest fire ladders in the New York Fire Department at the time only reached the 6th floor.
The 6th floor. And the factories on the 8th, 9th, and 10th.
The firemen were extending their ladders as far as they would go, and the workers on the 9th floor were looking down at ladders that stopped 30 feet below them.
So the firemen try to use life nets, right?
Yeah.
The heavy canvases they hold out to catch jumping people.
They deployed the nets, yes. But the nets were designed for people jumping from the 3rd or 4th floor. They were not designed to withstand the velocity of an adult body falling from a height of 90 or 100 feet.
Oh, God.
When the workers jumped, the kinetic energy was so immense that they simply tore straight through the heavy canvas nets, or they struck the nets with such force that the firemen holding them were thrown to the ground and injured. The nets were completely ineffective.
So the crowd just has to stand there and watch it happen. I can't even fathom the psychological trauma of standing there. The specific helplessness of bearing witness to a mass casualty event where you are separated from the victims only by vertical space.
It was a collective trauma for the entire city. The sound of the bodies hitting the pavement was described by witnesses as something they could never, ever forget.
That goes, right?
Yeah. And among that crowd on the street, standing near Washington Square Park, was a young social worker named Frances Perkins. She had been having tea nearby when she heard the fire engines and ran to the scene. She stood there on the pavement and watched the young women fall, one by one.
She watched the exact people she had been trying to help in her social work, the young immigrant working class, be slaughtered by the environment she had been fighting against.
Precisely. That experience of profound, absolute helplessness in the face of systemic cruelty fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. She realized in that moment that charity was not enough.
Persuasion was not enough.
The only way to stop this was to completely dismantle and rebuild the legal structures that allowed it. We will come back to Frances Perkins because her presence on that sidewalk is one of the most important pivots in American history.
We will definitely come back to her. But to conclude this grim timeline of the fire itself, from the moment the cutter's spark hit those scrap bins to the moment the fire was largely burned out, less than 20 minutes had passed.
Just 20 minutes.
In less than 20 minutes, 146 people were dead. The vast majority of them were young immigrant women.
146 lives erased in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee.
So naturally, you hear this. You process the timeline, you process the deliberate locking of the doors, the ignored warnings from the strike a year earlier. And you think anyone with a sense of morality would think a catastrophe of this scale, with this much clearer documented negligence, has to result in swift, severe legal justice.
Right.
You expect the men who locked those doors, Blank and Harris, to be held fully accountable in a court of law.
And that expectation leads us directly into what is arguably one of the most frustrating, morally infuriating courtroom battles in American history, because justice, in the legal sense, did not arrive.
Yeah.
The legal system did exactly what it was designed to do at the time. It protected capital and property over human life.
Let's get into the trial, because the mechanics of how Blank and Harris escaped justice are fascinating and appalling. The public fury was deafening, the city was in an uproar, so the district attorney does act. Blank and Harris are actually indicted, right?
They were indicted by a grand jury on charges of first-degree and second-degree manslaughter. The prosecution, led by Charles Whitman, knew they had to build a specific case.
They couldn't just be vague about it.
Right. They couldn't just say you ran a bad factory. They had to prove criminal liability for the deaths. So the prosecution's entire case hinged specifically on that locked Washington Place door on the 9th floor.
The one that was padlocked.
Yes. They argued that by keeping that specific door locked, the owners directly caused the deaths of the specific workers trapped behind it. They focused the charges on the death of one specific victim, Margaret Schwartz, who was found dead near that door.
Okay, so the prosecution says, you locked the door, Margaret Schwartz died because she couldn't get through it, therefore you are guilty of manslaughter. It seems incredibly cut and dry.
It does.
They have hundreds of surviving witnesses who know the doors were locked every day. How do Blank and Harris possibly fight that?
Well, they hire a man named Max Stoyer. Max Stoyer was one of the most formidable, highly skilled, and expensive defense attorneys in New York at the time.
A heavy hitter.
He was known as a legal shark, a master of cross-examination. And Stoyer analyzes the law, and he realizes he cannot win on the facts of the factory environment. He knows the door was locked. He knows the workers know it was locked.
So what's his angle? How do you defend the indefensible?
He focuses on the specific, narrow legal definition of intent and knowledge, the concept of mens rea, or guilty mind. The judge in the case, Thomas Crane, issued a very strict instruction to the jury. He told them that in order to convict Blank and Harris of manslaughter, the prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt not just that the door was locked, but that Blank and Harris personally knew that the specific Washington Place door was locked at the exact moment the fire broke out.
Wait, so if the owners had a daily policy of locking the doors, but they couldn't be proven to have personally checked that specific lock at 4:30 p.m. on that specific Saturday, they could get away with it.
That was Stoyer's exact strategy. He didn't have to prove the door was unlocked. He just had to cast reasonable doubt on the owner's personal knowledge of the lock at that exact moment.
Wow.
And to do that, he ruthlessly attacked the credibility of the surviving workers who took the stand for the prosecution.
I want to talk about how he did this because it's a masterclass in legal manipulation. He cross-examined a young survivor named Kate Alterman, didn't he?
Yes, the cross-examination of Kate Alterman is one of the most famous moments in legal history. Kate Alterman was a young immigrant, deeply traumatized, speaking English as a second language.
She must have been terrified.
On direct examination by the prosecution, she gave a very powerful, highly detailed account of seeing Margaret Schwartz die at the locked door.
But the prosecution had coached her,
Yeah.
right? They had prepped her heavily.
They had prepped her as any prosecutor would, but she had memorized her statement almost word for word. Stoyer noticed this. So during his cross-examination, he didn't attack her aggressively. He spoke to her softly.
Disarming her.
Yes. He asked her to repeat her story, and she repeated it using the exact same phrases, the exact same sequence of words.
And then he asked her to repeat it again.
He asked her to repeat it several times, sometimes starting from the middle of the story, and every time she regurgitated the exact same phrasing. Stoyer used this to suggest to the jury that her testimony was entirely fabricated and rehearsed by the prosecution.
Ah, so he makes it look like she's a parrot.
Exactly. He didn't have to prove she was lying about the fire. He just had to make the jury feel like she was a puppet of the district attorney. He confused the witnesses, he discredited their memories of the exact sequence of events in a panic, and he established that reasonable doubt.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean infuriating. You'd think a jury of 12 men would look at the broader culture of the factory, The history of the strike, the daily policy of bag searches, the 146 bodies on the pavement, and say, "We see what you're doing, Mr. Stoyer, but these men are responsible for this environment."
But that is the harsh reality of the legal standard versus moral responsibility. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours.
2 hours.
In December of 1911, just months after the fire, the jury returned their verdict. They acquitted both Max Blank and Isaac Harris of manslaughter. They walked completely free.
I just want to sit with that for a second. The men who created the conditions, who actively fought against union demands for safety, who enforced the policy of locking the doors to check for stolen blouses, walked completely free. No criminal consequences whatsoever.
None. One of the jurors later said to a reporter, "I cannot see that anyone was responsible for the disaster. It seems to me it was an act of the Almighty."
An act of the Almighty, blaming God for a padlocked door. That is astounding.
Yeah.
But surely there was some financial penalty. The families of the victims pursued a civil suit against the owners later on, didn't they?
They did. Civil court has a lower burden of proof than criminal court. And in that civil suit, a settlement was eventually reached 3 years later.
Break down the math for me here. What was the price of a young woman's life in the American legal system in 1914?
I must offer a crucial caveat here to be historically precise. The civil settlements were paid out by the casualty insurance company that Blank and Harris held policies with. The amounts varied slightly depending on the individual claims filed by the families. However, the widely reported and accepted average payout was roughly $75 per death.
$75, that's devastating. But let's look at the other side of the ledger. Let's look at the insurance payout that Blank and Harris received for their property.
This is where the economic calculus becomes truly macabre. Blank and Harris were heavily insured against property damage and loss of business. After the fire, they filed claims with multiple insurance companies.
Of course they did.
They ended up collecting roughly $60,000 more in insurance payouts than the actual calculated value of their lost property.
Wait, are you saying they made a profit?
Structurally, yes. The insurance windfall for the property damage far exceeded the fractional amounts their casualty insurance paid to the families of the dead. The fire, financially speaking, was a net positive for the Shirtwaist Kings.
I want to explicitly bust a myth right now for you listening. There is often this comforting, neat narrative arc we try to map onto history. A tragedy happens, society is outraged, there's a trial, the villains are punished, and society learns its lesson and moves forward.
It rarely works that cleanly.
Right. The popular assumption that justice was served in a courtroom for the Triangle workers is entirely, completely false. The men responsible faced zero criminal consequences. The civil payout of $75 was a grotesque insult, and the owners essentially walked away wealthier.
It is a stark, undeniable reminder that the legal system is not always a justice system. And this specific, spectacular failure of the legal system is exactly what connects the dots to the most important part of our story today.
Aftermath.
Because when the legal system utterly failed the victims, the survivors, the labor organizers, and the progressive reformers realized a fundamental truth. They could not rely on the courts to protect them.
Right.
They couldn't wait for a judge's gavel to make their workplaces safe. They had to bypass the judiciary entirely, seize political power, and rewrite the actual laws of the state from the ground up.
Which brings us to the massive shift from grief and outrage to hard-won, concrete civic accomplishment. Because what happened next was an extraordinary mobilization of political will.
It really was. The public outrage over the fire was immense. Tens of thousands of people marched silently in the rain during the funeral procession for the unidentified victims.
Just massive silent marches.
But public outrage alone dissipates. It fades when the headlines change. What made the difference here was the organizing. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Women's Trade Union League, and a broad coalition of progressive reformers took that raw, visceral public fury over the fire and the acquittal, and they weaponized it into sustained political power.
But you have a caveat here, right? Because it's easy to look back and say the fire changed everything, as if the flames magically birthed the labor movement.
Exactly. I want to stress this heavily. The fire didn't magically create the movement for workplace safety. The 146 deaths didn't cause change in a vacuum. The infrastructure for change was already there.
Built by the strikers from 1909.
Yes. It was this sustained organizing built by the exact same people who had been on strike in 1909, the people who had been beaten by police on the picket lines, the people who refused to let an acquittal be the end of the story that was the decisive ingredient. The tragedy was a catalyst, But the unions and the reformers were the engine. They forced the politicians to listen.
So how did they actually change the law?
Yeah.
What was the mechanism that turned street protests into state law?
The primary mechanism was the creation of the New York State Factory Investigating Commission. Because of the intense political pressure brought by the unions, the public, and wealthy progressive allies, the state legislature in Albany had to act. They couldn't just sweep it under the rug.
So they set up a committee?
They formed this commission, and they gave it unprecedented subpoena power and investigative authority.
The roster of this commission is incredible. It's like a who's who of 20th century American political titans.
Right.
The commission was chaired by State Senator Robert F. Wagner.
Yes, and the vice chair was a man named Al Smith.
Right, who was a product of the Tammany Hall political machine, but who would go on to be a four-term governor of New York and the Democratic presidential nominee in 1928.
Wagner and Smith provided the legislative muscle, but the driving force, the chief investigator who essentially ran the daily operations of the commission, was Frances Perkins.
The woman who watched them jump from the street.
Exactly. Frances Perkins channeled the profound trauma of witnessing the fire directly into relentless forensic investigative work.
Let's break down how this commission operated, because they didn't just sit in a room and read testimony about the Triangle Fire. What did they actually do?
That was the genius of their approach. They realized that if they just wrote a report on the Asch Building, the problem wouldn't be solved. So they used the tragedy of the Triangle Fire as a political battering ram to pry open industries statewide.
They went on tour.
They spent several years conducting surprise, unannounced inspections of factories all over New York State.
And Frances Perkins specifically made sure the politicians went with her, didn't she?
She did. She knew that politicians like Al Smith needed to see the conditions with their own eyes. She would take these powerful men into foundries, meatpacking plants, commercial bakeries, and garment sweatshops.
Dragging them into the reality of it.
Yes. She would make them climb up flimsy, rust-eaten fire escapes. She made them crawl through unventilated basements where children were working 12-hour shifts. They documented locked doors, horrific sanitation, unguarded heavy machinery that severed limbs, and systemic child labor.
They built an overwhelming, undeniable mountain of data about how deadly American workplaces were. They proved that Triangle wasn't an anomaly, it was the standard operating procedure.
Exactly.
So they gather all this evidence. What were the concrete results? Walk us through the actual legislation that came out of this commission.
The legislative legacy is staggering. Between 1912 and 1914, the Commission's work resulted in 36 sweeping new labor laws enacted in New York State. It was the most comprehensive overhaul of labor conditions in American history up to that point.
Give us the specifics. How did they fix the architectural failures of the Asch Building?
Well, they mandated, by law, that all factory doors must open outward so a panic crush could never again seal a door shut.
Right.
They made it a strict, enforceable legal requirement that exit doors must remain unlocked during all business hours, completely outlawing the bag search bottleneck that killed the Triangle workers. They mandated proper load-bearing fire escapes.
So no more decorative iron structures?
Right. They instituted mandatory fire drills. And crucially, they required automatic sprinkler systems for high-occupancy manufacturing buildings.
It's amazing how basic that sounds to us now. Unlocked doors and sprinklers. We take them completely for granted today. But they had to fight tooth and nail, and 146 people had to die to make that the law.
And the laws went far beyond just fire safety, too. The Commission passed laws establishing maximum working hours for women and children, strictly limiting the 50-plus hour weeks.
So tackling the broader exploitation.
Exactly. They instituted baseline factory sanitation codes requiring proper ventilation to clear out the cotton dust, adequate lighting, and clean bathroom facilities. They mandated guards on dangerous machinery.
And this didn't just stay in New York, did it? New York was the laboratory.
Yes. The slate of laws passed in New York became the gold standard. It became the template that was studied, debated, and adopted in whole or in part across the entire United States in the decades that followed.
It set a new precedent.
It fundamentally shifted the baseline of what an employer was legally required to provide for a worker. The state established, for the first time, that it had a duty to protect the physical bodies of its citizens in the workplace.
Which brings us full circle to Frances Perkins. I love her arc in this story because it shows how a single moment in history can shape the future of a nation. 2 decades after watching the Triangle workers jump to their deaths, Frances Perkins gets a call from the newly elected President of the United States.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1933, amidst the depths of the Great Depression,
FDR makes her the first female U.S. cabinet member in history, appointing her as Secretary of Labor.
And from that position, carrying the memory of 1911 with her, Perkins became one of the principal architects of the New Deal.
The entire New Deal.
The policies she helped craft and push through Congress, including the creation of Social Security, the federal minimum wage, the establishment of the 40-hour work week, unemployment insurance, and the federal banning of child labor. They constitute the modern architecture of American labor law. She took the grief and the data of 1911 and built a social safety net for the entire country.
There's a famous quote from her about this exact connection, right?
Yes. Looking back on her life and the origins of the New Deal, she famously noted that the New Deal was essentially born on the sidewalk outside the Asch Building on that Saturday in 1911.
That is just so powerful.
The foundation of modern American worker protections was forged in the ashes of the Triangle Fire.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to synthesize exactly what this history means for us today. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire was not a random, unavoidable tragedy. It was the completely predictable result of an economic system that prioritized property, inventory, and profit margins over human beings.
Yes.
It was a system whose warnings were loudly, clearly, and repeatedly ignored until 146 people were dead on the pavement. The justice we enjoy today, the fact that you have safe, outward-swinging unlocked doors in your office, the fact that there are sprinklers above your head, the fact that you aren't legally allowed to work a 70-hour week for pennies didn't come from a judge's gavel.
Because the legal system failed them.
The safety we have today came from relentless, dedicated organizers, mostly young immigrant women, who refused to be silenced twice.
And if we analyze the mechanics of this history, it raises a profoundly important, uncomfortable question for our own time.
What's that?
Well, we know that the tragedy in 1911 only happened because the explicit warnings of the 1909 strikers were dismissed. But we must remember why they were dismissed. They were ignored because of who was doing the warning: young, immigrant, working-class women.
Right. They were marginalized.
Those in power simply did not respect them, believe them, or value their lives enough to listen.
So if we look around at the architecture of our modern economy, we have to ask, have we actually solved the problem of the Asch Building, or have we just moved it out of sight?
That is exactly the provocative thought we need to leave with. We look at our modern, sanitized offices with outward swinging doors, and we feel safe. But what about the global supply chains that manufacture the fast fashion, the electronics, the goods we consume every day?
It's all outsourced now.
When factories collapse in Bangladesh, or when workers in overseas supply chains sound the alarm about locked doors, forced labor, and unlivable conditions, are we not just witnessing the Asch Building outsourced?
We're repeating the cycle.
Are we, as a global society, still ignoring systemic warnings because we don't respect or see the people sounding the alarm? And what will it take for us to finally listen to them before the disaster happens, rather than relying on another tragedy to force our hands?
That is a staggering question to take away, and it reframes exactly how we look at the tags on our clothing today. I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you. Keep looking for the history baked into the everyday things like an unlocked door. And just as we started, remember that window on the 9th floor. Remember the young worker looking out, hoping for the whistle to blow. We owe it to her to keep listening to the voices that our systems try to silence.